warm welcome to Yatik. And today we have a very special guest, none other than the Associate Professor from the University of Sydney and a sociologist from Australia. Mr. Salvatore babones is joining with us. Welcome, Salvatore G. Namaste from India. Thank you for giving your time and giving this wonderful interview for us and joining us in our platform. Thank you so much, Salvatore G.
Oh, my pleasure, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay, okay. So let me begin. Whenever you are in India, like you became a rock star in a few days. Everyone was taking your interviews, and you were rocking the internet like anything, actually. So let me start from there. So how does the world sees India? And we will talk about the ratings, which is you are talking in a brief manner also. So let me ask you in a very simple manner: how does the world sees today's India?
The world largely doesn't see India, and that's the problem. The level of knowledge of India in the outside world is very, very low. And the result of that is that any small number of shrill voices can completely dominate that narrative. I'll make that very practical. I mean, in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, the three big US papers, each one has essentially one columnist who writes all of the opinion pieces about India. And in each case, that columnist is either from India or I think in one case might be from Bangladesh. I'm not sure. They're all South Asian, which means that all of the opinion that most Americans would ever see, and I mean most Americans who subscribe to major newspapers would ever see about India comes from three people. And it doesn't come from a representative sampling of three people. It comes from three people who have these connections to the US media outlets. And that's all people would see. Most Americans, most Australians would have no news about India whatsoever. India is simply a Diwali event. Once a year, they may hear a human interest story. So, in that environment where knowledge of India is extremely low, where people just don't have opinions about India, a small number of shrill voices are able to have a disproportionate impact on the narrative.
Okay, okay, okay. Do you say that the world is not actually seeing what the Indians are doing and what the Indians are exploring the world?
Well, look, a few people who follow India closely are aware of India. So business people are very keyed into
Okay,
India. They see it as an important market. They also see it as an important source of talent. Some universities are keyed into India. They want to get students from India.
okay,
Of course, defense contractors are very keyed into India. They want to sell weapons to India. But these are people with very specific purposes for which to view India. And frankly, most of them don't care much about the sorts of things I've been studying. They don't care whether India is considered a democracy or considered a dictatorship, as long as India is
okay,
willing to send students. I mean, the universities that I've written extensively about, Western universities' international student recruitment, they're very happy to recruit from China. They're very happy to do research collaboration with China. The fact that China is a totalitarian regime doesn't come up at all. So when I say that people really have very low awareness of India, I mean among either the broad population or more specifically among the news reading population, there's very little knowledge of India. Of course, those who want to do business with India want to do business with India. But for everyone else, it's a surprisingly low priority on their news agenda.
okay, okay. Got it, got it, got it. So you were saying about the democracy, which is there in India. We are one of the largest democracy in the world. So how do you rate the democracy? Because in India we follow democracy, but some of the Indians itself say that is democracy still alive or what like that. So how do you rate India's democracy from an world's point of view or from your perspective also? How do you rate India's democracy, sir?
So first, I can't know how good India's democracy is, and I stress that nobody can know, how good India's democracy is. The real question is, are Indians happy with it? That said, we do have systematic attempts to measure democracy cross nationally, and in my research, I've criticized those indices for the methodological problems, and even in some cases, the outright mendacity, the outright lying that I see in the three major democracy indices. Now, that is not to say that I have some inside knowledge about Indian democracy, but I do have having spent the last 3 or 4 years studying Indian democracy for a book project, I do feel like I have at least some feeling for the quality of Indian democracy. And so let me give you an example. The Rise of Democracy Institute ranks India 100th in the world among all countries in the world, not among democracies. Now that places it 100th out of 179 countries it ranks. That means worse than average, but not worse than average for a democracy, worse than average for a country. I mean, the bottom of that 179 is dominated by countries like China, Cuba, North Korea, Cambodia, Laos, that don't have elections at all, which means that among countries that actually have elections, India is ranked as one of the worst countries in the world for democracy. Now, I find that purely incredible. And I mean incredible not in the sense of incredible, Jai Hind. I mean that in the sense of it is simply not credible. Whether India should be ranked number 40 or number 20 or number 5, I can't tell you. That India should not be ranked number 100, yes, I'm very sure India should not be ranked number 100. And in fact, when I go to the detailed analyses that support that number 100 ranking, I find very serious methodological flaws and very serious misrepresentations of data from India.
Okay. So, does some of the rankings are really meant to disgrace India's position in the global world? Do you think like that?
Unfortunately, when there's an information poor environment, that's all people know. So, for example, I'll get away from democracy a minute to press freedom. In the World Press Freedom Index, Australia, in its entry from from Reporters Sans Frontières, they say that 85% of Australian journalists fear government repression. Now, when I told Australians that, they said, "What, you mean India?" I said, no, I mean Australia. They said, "You must be crazy. Of course it's not like that in Australia." And the fact is, because we have confidence in Australian institutions, because those of us who live in Australia are familiar with Australia, we take that with a grain of salt. That didn't even get reported in Australia. Nobody cared in Australia that Reporters Sans Frontières had these very negative things to say about Australia, because we have a very information-rich environment. Even Americans are very aware of Australia. On the other hand, India is in a very information-poor environment globally. The rest of the world does not follow news in India. As a result, when India is ranked very low, we take that seriously. When we read in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal that India is no longer truly a democratic country, why should we question that? Now, many people have said in the last 6 years, Democrats between 2016 and 2020, and Republicans between 2021 and 22, many Americans have said, "Oh, America is no longer a democracy." Do we listen to them? No, because we live in a very information-rich environment about America. But when the only 2 or 3 people we hear speaking about India, when the only major international evaluations tell us that India is no longer a democracy, why should ordinary Americans or ordinary Australians or Europeans, why should they doubt that account? I can tell you why they should doubt it. They should doubt it because it's not true, but they don't know that it's not true, and we have no reasonable way to expect them to know it's not true.
Okay. So at one point of time, we are agreeing with the World Intellectual Property Rights, and we are agreeing with the World Bank's ratings, and we are agreeing with the World Economic Forum's ratings also. There are a number of ratings and rankings which has been given by the World Economic Forum or by the World Bank for, say, World Gender Gap Index, and for, say, like ease of doing business. Like, there are a number of ratings which is given by the renowned institutions. But why there is a controversy which is coming on when the Global Hunger Index has been released? Why there is a controversy which is coming on when the Press Freedom Index has been released? So, we are accepting that, but why are we not accepting this kind of a rating, sir?
Look, first of all, I'm not sure that you're accepting these other rankings, and I'm not sure these other rankings are accurate. The World Hunger Index, for example,
any kind of indexes.
Sorry.
Any kind of indexes, you are not. They are not accurate. You are saying that any kind of indexes is not accurate.
Oh, I'm sure that some rankings are accurate, but the ones that I've studied have very serious flaws in them, including the World Hunger Index had very serious flaws in it. And ironically, they weren't the flaws that the government identified. So the government of India released a very defensive document saying how terrible the World Hunger Index was, they missed the fact that India's decline on the World Hunger Index between 2014 and today, all of that was due to an incorrectly reported figure for 2014.
Okay.
A figure that was incorrectly reported in 2014 by the previous government, presumably, though I can't verify this, presumably to make themselves look good in an election year. No, I
Okay.
can't know that for sure. It's just very suspicious that they underestimated hunger, and then when the true figure came out a year later, it was much lower. Okay, so when we see errors like this, and there are errors like this in the World Hunger Index, there are errors like this in the democracy rankings. Honestly, I don't know if there are also errors in the intellectual property indices. I haven't examined those. When there are errors like this, instead of getting defensive, the Indian government really should be looking at how do we fix the errors? How do we audit the data and ensure the data are accurate? Because personally, I'm confident that the true factual narrative about India is much more positive than the narrative we see coming out of these rankings. And that means if you just fix the data, you could dramatically improve India's placement. You don't just have to have this kind of knee-jerk reaction that, well, if India is being criticized, it must be because people are anti-India. Very often, India is coming out badly in these rankings because the data are bad. And that's not India's fault, but it's a much more productive way forward to argue against it.
Since you were in India, you were also saying about the anti-Indian narrative forces on these rankings and all such activities which is happening against India. Do you agree with that? What is an international narrative is built against India?
No, in fact, that's exactly the opposite of what I said in that India Today conclave interview. What I said in the interview was it's not the international organizations that are biased against India. It's India's own intellectuals who are very often biased against India, which is to say international organizations are just putting together a database. But when they're using subjective opinion, when they're turning to India's own intellectuals for their subjective opinion of India, we find an incredible deterioration of Indian intellectuals' evaluations of Indian democracy, and then more broadly of India's social and religious and press indicators. Right. So we see a lot more negative reporting about India. Is that negative reporting factual? I have serious questions about that. And that's what my prior research, my August research paper, was about, the lack of factual basis for these subjective opinions. It's not that international organizations are somehow biased against India. There are biases, and some of those biases are built in, they're unfair in some ways, but the main situation affecting India, especially the deterioration in India's performance since 2014, is not due to the biases. The biases were there in 2014 and they're there today. The deterioration is due to the changing subjective evaluations of India's own intellectuals who are surveyed for many of these rankings.
Okay. So, from your point of view, Zip, so how is what India needs to do, or in what are all the fields India needs to develop itself? So, we have seen the global hunger index, we are there and down, and let's say corruption index, we are there, we are doing far better, and in press freedom index also, like I would say openly from here. India gives much more freedom to all kind of journalists and press related things than any other country in the world. I would accept that because I'm a part of a journalist also. So,
Well,
like,
you're the
what
journalist,
India?
but on
Yeah,
the Press
exactly.
Freedom Index, India rates worse than Hong Kong, which is just
Okay.
incredible. But that's what India's most elite journalists are telling Reporters Sans Frontiers. Now, I don't know if Reporters Sans Frontiers have come to talk to you. They certainly don't come to talk to the native language media in
Okay.
India.
So then, how these kinds of ratings are taken actually?
Oh, they're based on surveys. So they're based on elite
Okay.
surveys where the Reporters Sans Frontières or Freedom House or Rise of Democracy Institute are surveying elite Indians, elite, typically English-speaking Indians, typically Indians who have international connections, the sorts of Indians who receive awards internationally, who write for international newspapers. That stratum of Indian intellectuals is being asked about the quality of Indian institutions. And it's my belief, based on the data I've seen, that this stratum of intellectuals are are allowing their own personal political preferences to influence their subjective evaluations. I mean, let me make this very concrete. Verizon Democracy Institute has a question on it about the autonomy of the Electoral Commission of India. Now, I don't know how autonomous the Electoral Commission of India is. You don't know. Nobody knows. Only the people on the Electoral Commission know in their hearts, have we been politically influenced or have we been truly independent? So we can't actually know the answer to this question. Yet, the construction of these indices, whether it's a corruption index or a Verizon Democracy Index, requires that someone, in this case, Indian political scientists, provide an evaluation. How independent do we think it is? In their subjective evaluation, the uh, the Electoral Commission of India has declined dramatically in its independence and autonomy over the past 7 years. I'm sorry, over the past 8 years. Now, has it actually? I don't know. You form your own judgment. If you believe that the Electoral Commission of India is still a bedrock of autonomy and independence, then you can dismiss the rankings, because the rankings are based on the subjective views of people who believe it's no longer independent. Now, when I see that the people who believe it's no longer independent also personally strongly oppose Narendra Modi, who won the election, then I have to ask, okay, did they come to an objective realization that the Electoral Commission was no longer independent, or did they assume that because the person they didn't like won the election, does that mean the Electoral Commission of India must have been compromised? Now,
Uh,
I think that second mechanism is much more likely than the first mechanism. But I want to stress, I can't know. But all of the press reporting I've seen about the Electoral Commission of India suggests that it's extraordinarily highly respected, that there was only one controversial decision made by the Electoral Commission in 2019. It was a very minor decision over the timing of the announcement of a successful missile launch. And that was, on the border. Should the Electoral Commission have ruled differently on that? I don't know. I'm not an Indian lawyer. This is not my business. But did that seem to me as evidence of a major compromise? Remember, the expert appraisal of the press commission's independence didn't just go down a tiny tick; it went down by a massive amount. So, was that one question over the missile launch announcement? Did that indicate a major decline in the Electoral Commission's independence, or was that just one decision among many, and sometimes you win some, sometimes you lose some? My impression from reading Indian reporting on the matter is that it was the latter. But if you truly believe that the Electoral Commission of India is no longer independent, then you can accept the VDEM rankings. I can't tell you what the truth is.
Okay, got it. So, what are all the aspects, or what are all the fields do we need to improve ourselves, sir? Your kind recommendations for that. So, India needs to do this, and India doesn't want to do this. What are your set of recommendations, sir?
I recommend that India simply collect and provide more data. Personally, I've become convinced that the actual factual data about India present a very positive view of India. And what we see that's negative about India is always based on subjective evaluation, which means the more we can shift the analysis of Indian democracy and Indian institutions from a subjective foundation to an objective foundation, the better that narrative will be. So again, let me make that very concrete. We've heard a lot in the international academic world about the supposed repression of Muslims in Narendra Modi's India, the supposed repression of Muslims since 2014. Now, again, I'm not Muslim. I'm not Indian. I can't know the reality of Muslims' feelings of repression. Okay, but the Pew Research Center in the United States, the world's leading survey research organization, did in 2019, 2020, just before the pandemic, they did a major national survey in India of attitudes towards religion. They found that more than 85% of India's Muslims said they are very free to practice their religion. What's more, they asked, do you feel there's discrimination against your group? They asked Muslims, Hindus, every major religious group in India. Every religious group, including Muslims, said that about a quarter of them said we experienced discrimination based on our religion. A quarter of Muslims did, but also a quarter of Christians did, and a quarter of Hindus did. Now, a quarter sounds bad, But when you compare it to Pew asked the exact same question in the United States, more than 80% of African Americans say they experience discrimination. More than 60% of Hispanic, I'm sorry, I believe it was around 60% of Hispanic Americans. Even more than 40% of Asian Americans said they experienced discrimination, which means that if I take that same question and I ask, do Muslims face discrimination in India? And I compare it to America, every major group in the United States, every major minority group says that it experiences more discrimination than Muslims face in India. Okay, this gives me a very strong factual basis on which to reject the notion that Muslims face serious discrimination or serious repression in India. Now, a reporter will tell me, Rajdeep Sardesai will tell me, what about this incident where a Muslim business was burned down? And I'll say, look, I don't know about that incident. I'm a social scientist. I'm not a journalist. In a country of 1.4 billion people, there will be an incident of everything. You can always find an incident. My question is, do Muslims systematically across India feel repression? And I know, as a social scientist, they're reporting that they don't. So having that knowledge base, which we didn't have just 5 years ago, I mean, this Pew survey was the first major survey to ask these attitudes, is an incredible data foundation. Now, if I were in charge of India's public diplomacy, I would go to the Pew Research Center, say, we'll establish a foundation, we'll endow it so that no one can accuse this of any kind of influence, and we'll just pay for this survey to be done every 5 years. Let's start tracking it. Because, first of all, it's a good news story for India. Second, it's a policy tool for India. I mean, the Indian government should want to know, are there any religious minorities in India, or even majorities, who feel oppressed? If they do, let's hear about it. Let's have the data to fix it. So it's a win on both counts. So when I say that India should produce better data, I'm really very confident that the actual data on India are much more positive than the subjective opinions that I see repeated over and over again in the Western media.
Got it. So since you are mentioning that right from 2014 alone, this anti-Muslim sentiments have been posted on India. So can we take it like this? This is a narrative which is posted against Mr. Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Yes, very much so. I mean, and the first thing that alerted me to this and made me start wanting to look into this was, again, the Pew Research Center. In their polling on the 2019 election, they found that 19% of Muslims actually voted for the BJP. Now, that statistic to me was shocking because I'd heard at the time that there was a Muslim genocide going on in India. And I thought, well, usually people don't vote for their oppressors. I mean, if there was a Muslim genocide, you wouldn't get 19% of the Muslims. Now, 19% is still poor. I mean, the BJP got 49% of the Hindu vote. But again, if you compare it internationally, the Republican Party in the US gets less than 8% of the black vote. Does that mean that it's a fundamentally racist party, or just that there is a quote unquote vote bank where vote bank politics favor the Democrats for African Americans, right? So again, that 19% of Muslims voting BJP in 2019, to me, was a very strong data-driven, and I emphasize that. I don't know anything about India except what I get through the data. I don't trust any of the people who contact me on Twitter and say, Salvatore, let me tell you the truth about India. All I look at are the data. Okay. That data-driven narrative is so much more positive for India than the subjective narrative we hear. It's one that I think India should really do much more to put forward.
Okay. At the end of the day, as you said that these data or these rankings matters to the elite people who are there in whatever country. So be it India, Africa, Australia, any other country. So it matters only to the elite people. Does this rankings matters to the common people of either in India?
No, look, it doesn't matter to any ordinary person, but it does matter for India as a country because the rankings are used. So, for example, if India is negotiating a contract for the sale of licensing of U.S. defense technology, that has to go through Congress. And an anti-India lobbying group goes to Congress with a stack of documents saying India is a fascist country. India is no longer a democracy. Most prestigious institutes say that India has lost its status as a democracy, number 100 in the world. Well, that can be very persuasive for a member of Congress who really doesn't know much about India, but doesn't want to be caught in the embarrassment of voting in favor for a technology sharing with a fascist regime. Okay. Second, the rankings, and especially the Varieties of Democracy Institute ranking, enter into all sorts of secondary and tertiary models. So VDEM's rankings go into specifically into the U.S. Agency for International Development's governance statistics, and they go into the World Bank's governance statistics. These, in turn, are used in bond rating models and in country risk models. So India comes up in these models as having a higher than real country risk because of its poor performance on these governance indicators. So the result is that everyone in India who borrows internationally, whether it's the government or Adani or any organization that's raising money overseas, is paying just a fraction more. Now, it's not a lot more. Maybe it's a quarter of a percentage point. Maybe it's a tenth of a percentage point more. But a tenth of a percentage point on hundreds of billions of dollars starts to add up. It's simply a drag on India. It's not a major barrier. Look, India is going to grow 7, 8%. India is going to grow anyway. India is going to be a successful country anyway. But it's a constant drag on India's growth and on India's emergence as a as a global power. It's
Uh,
always going to be a problem.
okay. Okay, okay. One last question, Salvatore ji, because since India is hosting G20 this year, Shanghai Cooperation Organization is headed by India this year, and as you said, India is emerging as a global leader. That too, in
And
far
hosting the Quad Leaders Summit.
exactly, exactly. And last month it was holding the UN Security Council head also. So as a global leader, it is emerging in the global level also, and it is leading in Asia, where China is also there. What do you see India as a potential global leader in the next decade also?
Look, India is already a global leader. The question is
Okay.
what level of global leadership. Now, I remind Indians. I know there's a lot of pride tied up in this, but I remind Indians that one thing that makes a country systemically important in the world is that country having an interventionist foreign policy. I don't think India wants to have an interventionist foreign policy. So why, for example, is Russia globally important? Russia is a very small economy. It's a country. Russia's economy is uh, roughly the size of Turkey's, right? It's slightly larger than Turkey's. It's not. It is not an especially important part of the global trading system. Yeah, but Russia invades its neighbors. Russia sends weapons to Ukraine. Russia is very aggressive on the global stage, and that's what makes it, for lack of a better word, a global leader. Right? It's a country that whose opinion matters because it's willing to do things that I hope India is not willing to do. Right? So whether India should be a global leader or not, a lot of that depends on, is India going to take an interventionist approach? I mean, China's already built a military base in the Horn of Africa and has plans to expand in Africa. Is India going to build a military base in Djibouti and start sending soldiers to Africa? I doubt it. And I think that's a good thing that India doesn't do it.
Okay.
But if India is not going to be a problem for the world, then the unfortunate irony is that India doesn't get a seat at the table. And that may be very unpleasant to hear, that by being a good global actor, India ends up being ignored. That's the unfortunate reality of global geopolitics.
Okay, 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 okay. Thank you so much for your wonderful time, Salvatore ji, and thank you so much for from the people of India. I have say a very good thank you to you, and you please come regularly to Indian medias and Indian channels, and whenever you have time and set things right. And thank you for your great work. Thank you so much, Salvatore ji.
You're too kind. Thank you very much.